Hello and welcome to our new podcast with Morning Consult Economic Intelligence. I'm Sofia and this is my co-host Kayla. Hi Kayla.
Hi. Hi, Sophia.
We are going to be releasing this podcast bi-weekly with a newsletter, and we're going to be discussing all things economics. In the beginning of the episode, we'll talk about and do a temperature check of various aspects of the economy to put things into context. And then the second half of the episode, we're going to be discussing our research here at Morning Consult. Kayla, do you want to explain to our new viewers why we think that Morning Consult Intelligence, economic intelligence in particular, provides a new or interesting perspective and why we're doing this podcast?
Yeah, sure. So, we are economists. We love studying the economy. We love all the data that's out there, the government data, that we're looking at all the time, along with everyone else. What's really unique about some of the data that we have at Morning Consult that makes our jobs really fun is that basically what we do is we survey a lot of consumers, and that allows us to very quickly and at a very big scale understand really what consumers are thinking about these issues, what they're reporting about their circumstances, information about their household finances. It's really just, it feels like we can just ask them, what they're thinking about things, and that feels like a very unique and sort of special opportunity for us as economists. And I think that that's kind of what's fun about some of the data we have and hopefully what we can convey in our podcast.
Exactly. I couldn't agree more. We poll consumers every single day on some of our surveys, and we have some surveys that are regular and we can trend them over time and see how things change, which is also really useful. In addition, sometimes we run one-off surveys depending on what's going on in the economy and what questions we want to ask. So I think it's just a great way to provide extra context on the economy and especially on the perspective of consumers directly. And we can break that into different demographics, and it's just really interesting. So we wanted to provide some more context, and basically the podcast is also going to be serving as a way to maybe explain or talk things through a little bit more, because sometimes economics can be a little bit difficult to parse out, or maybe some people might find it a little bit dense or hard to read through. So just like providing a more conversational experience and talking through some of the things that are most interesting in our findings. So today we're going to start with our temperature check, or basically our zoom out on interest rates. And so I wanted to ask you, Kayla, on interest rates, where would you say that the temperature is at right now? Is it hot? Is it cold? Where are we at today?
Yeah, and for some context, I think on future episodes, this is a little thing that I think we're going to try to do at the start each time, sort of pick some aspect of the economy and just give a quick little pulse of sort of using, the weather and the temperature as a metaphor for sort of where we think that feature of the economy is today. So thinking about rates, I think of them as it's basically how restrictive is this on the economy. So for that reason, I'll think higher rates kind of freeze the economy, make it cold. And there's a lot of discussion around, what are the rates now versus what the neutral rate would be, which would be sort of like neutral on growth. I'm not going to get too into that. I'm more going to think, is this restrictive or not? And I would say it's a pretty cold day still. I would say it was like pretty much a winter day, especially with regards to some aspects like the housing market, the way rates had been for a very long time when they were up over 5%. And so now with this 50 basis point cut, we're still not that far from the peak. So I'd say maybe we were like low 40 degrees and now maybe we're high 40s, low 50s. It's definitely more comfortable. I would say that it's still pretty cold and it's still pretty restrictive. These aren't going to feel like very accommodative credit conditions where the rates still are, just being so close to the peak. Would you agree, Sophia?
I completely agree. And I guess another thing I wanted to follow up on that is we had a lot of discussion leading up to the meeting on if they were going to do 25 or if they were going to do 50. So um, going with 50 was a little bit of a bolder move because the Fed normally goes in 25 basis point increments. But we were thinking in the days leading up to the cut that it would actually be 50. Do you want to talk through that a little bit and how we ended up landing on thinking it might be 50 and then it was.
Yeah, because I, as you know, did a total 180 in my expectations. Last week we were talking, and I really thought that they would err on the side of caution, which would have been a 25 basis point cut. But then just in the days before, different voices were speaking out, former Fed officials, a lot of like very powerful economic voices were kind of coming out, making the case for 50. And suddenly it felt like the market was like, yeah. And it had kind of laid the groundwork to make a 50 basis point cut okay, which we were pretty happy about, right? Because
Hmm.
of what we had thought, we had our own thoughts about the July meeting too. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, exactly what you said. We kind of changed our mind late in the game when all these former Fed officials came out in various different capacities saying that it should be 50. But I do think the sense that I'm getting at least is that 50 is a little bit of a correction from not cutting in July, especially after those really cool jobs market reports that came out. And Powell kind of talked about this during his press conference, like we're back on track or we're not falling behind. He kept using that kind of language of not falling behind. So I guess that brings me to my next point where, interest rates are still cool, you're saying. They're still a little bit restrictive. They're definitely not accommodative yet, although we're moving towards a more accommodative stance. The next question is how many more rate cuts are we going to get, especially this year? And do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I sort of take when they release the dot plot, it's their, their forecast for where they expect rates will be. I also think it's their forecast for where they hope to put rates. So I'm always inclined to sort of assume that if all the readings come out how they're hoping, and they're very, they're going to look at all the data releases, particularly labor and inflation. I think that's the path that they hope to follow, assuming
Yeah.
things go how they hope. Will there be surprises? I don't know.
So for
Yeah.
our listeners or viewers, the dot plot kind of shows either one or two more cuts at the end of the year. There's two more meetings, one in November and one in December, and so it kind of depends on how they vote, but it will probably be one or two more cuts. And do you think any of those will be 50 basis point cuts?
My It depends. Is always the answer. It depends on the data, and Powell even I think kind of said that. I think he emphasizes this pretty much every time. They're waiting for more data. Yeah, I think my guess a 50 point is cut is unusual, and we, as you said, we kind of suspect they did it because they had to catch up. Even though Powell says they're not catching up, we kind of think they're a little trying to catch up. I don't think they would do it again unless there was something like a very surprising downside surprise with labor market
Yeah.
conditions.
Yeah, I agree. And he kind of hinted at that during the press conference that this is not going to be the normal pace.
Yeah.
But again, as you said, and in economics, it always depends. So it depends on the data we get, and if things take a sudden turn in the economy, then we might get larger basis point cuts. But that brings us to our next topic. So interest rates matter because the whole point of a restrictive interest rate policy is to dampen demand and slow down a heating economy. Inflation was really high and now it's come down, so that's being turned around. But those interest rates have made their way down to consumer finances and, in some smaller part, consumer spending. But what we want to talk about today was our consumer finances report, and interest rates have had a role in how consumer finances have played out. So let's dig into that. The first thing I wanted to talk about was savings. And I was hoping that you could help us by giving some more perspective on how the savings environment has changed over the past few years. And, there's been a lot of discussion in the economics world about excess savings during the pandemic. And if you could walk us through that, that would be great.
For one thing, I feel like savings are not getting enough attention or haven't gotten enough attention, in part because coming out of kind of the early part of the pandemic, savings were not a problem. Savings were a great strength of consumers because of the excess savings that a lot of people had from stimulus checks and also just staying in and not actually spending that much when there were things like lockdowns and closures and things like that. So that did this kind of crazy jump in the data of excess savings and put consumers in a strong position to begin with. I mean, from a household balance sheet perspective.
Hmm.
Then inflation reared its ugly head,
Hmm.
peaking in 2022. And throughout that time, even as inflation has cooled, the cost of living has stayed so high. And what that has done, we've seen a depleted, even with incomes being pretty strong, there is a depleted savings rate because of that high cost of living. And it's just been just gradually like wearing down on consumers' savings to the point that that sort of position of strength is no more,
Hmm.
particularly for certain groups.
Hmm. Yeah, so that's great background. Basically, there has been a lot of discussion, especially earlier on in the post-pandemic world, about have we run out of excess savings or not. But we have a particular way of measuring how much liquid savings someone has, by liquid meaning like available to use right away. And that is by asking consumers every month if they were to lose their job, how many months could they cover basic expenses? And so, what we ended up doing is taking a net difference there. There's different amounts that they say they can save. The largest option in the survey is 6 months or more, the smallest one being less than a month. And so, we think net sufficient savings would be a greater share of consumers who have 6 months or more than those who have 1 month or less. 6 months or more is something that a lot of personal finance people encourage people to have 6 months or more of savings if they lose their job, but that's not always possible for everybody, especially depending on their income. So over time, we've kind of seen that change for all income groups. But do you want to maybe like talk about the income dynamics here that we're seeing between low, middle, and high income consumers, and how much savings they have saved up?
Yeah, and it's interesting, and Sophia describes sort of how the question framework is phrased, and if you think about that group that we've seen is taking up a rising share, who say that they have less than a month of savings, like that's really paycheck to paycheck, and and even 2 months, that's not much more. So,
Hmm.
um, yeah, we're really that's kind of the big takeaway. Over the past few years, we've seen more saying that they're living that they yeah, really are paycheck to paycheck in terms of not having that savings buffer. And unsurprisingly, though kind of sadly, you see a huge gap across income groups. But the lower income group, which will usually define or segment in our data as earning under 50,000 a year, they consistently are less of a savings stock, and actually we've seen a decline there, and that was one of the first groups we saw declining. What's been interesting is that the middle income group, which we define in our data as between 50,000 a year to 100,000 a year annual household income, that group has had kind of the most dramatic decline in this sort of stock of savings measure that Sophia described. And I think that's really interesting because we saw in 2023 pretty strong spending from them, and then in 2024 where we're seeing we've gradually seen that savings stock dip, they're not spending nearly as strongly, and they've been sort of showing the strongest increase in price sensitivities, all these measures that we look at, and just unwilling to spend as strongly as they were before. And it really seems like a lot of that might tie back to this. They sort of were spending above their means to keep up with the cost of living, and they just can't so much anymore.
So that's something exactly that we've seen in our data. Not only this savings data that we've been tracking, but also our spending data that last year when consumers were spending a lot of money, especially on discretionary spending like vacations and apparel, fun stuff that are not necessarily essential, middle and high income consumers were spending a lot more than the year before, and they were spending kind of in line with one another. And so it seems like they have kind of eroded their savings more in comparison with the high income group. And what I found particularly interesting about this savings stocks chart is that the high income group actually in the past year have managed to increase their savings and increase the amount of buffer they have in case they lose their job. I don't know exactly why that could be. Some of the theories I have is that, a lot of the layoffs that we heard about in the news were more, you heard people talking about a white collar recession a year or two ago, and that seems to have kind of cooled down a little bit in terms of hearing about layoffs in tech or maybe more higher paying white collar jobs. And then a lot of it could be just maybe performance in the stock market. The stock market's done really well in the past year, so maybe people have been able to grow their buffers of savings more.
But another potential factor, I think, maybe that's sort of disproportionately benefiting a high income group, they are much more likely to be homeowners and homeowners who have bought their homes, longer ago when interest rates were more favorable. And if you compare homeowners versus renters, lower income adults are more likely to be renters, higher income adults are more likely to be homeowners. Um, if you're a renter, your housing costs change more frequently because the lease turns over typically every year. There's different lease terms, but every time the lease ends, you're unless you're in a rent controlled area, most people aren't. Your rent could go up, and so they've and housing costs are the biggest thing in a consumer's budget in general. So if this high income group is a homeowner who bought has an interest rate 3 to 4% or something from years ago, has paid off most of their mortgage, they also bought at prices that were lower, that's kept their housing costs stable when all these renters who are more likely lower income are having to bear this rising cost. That's really putting a pinch on budgets. That's one theory. I don't think it's the only thing, but I think it's one thing that one of many that kind of disproportionately favors higher income adults financially.
That's super interesting. I didn't think about that, but that's a great point and a great plug for your housing report, which maybe we'll discuss in a future episode. Um, yeah, so I guess that's actually a good point for us to kind of switch over to this other part of our consumer finance report, which is credit. So credit is another thing that is really affected by interest rates because high interest rates makes the cost of money more expensive. That's something you hear a lot in an Econ 101 class or a Finance 101 class. So when you have more debt, it's more expensive to pay down that debt. So it becomes a little bit more dangerous in general to basically be in a lot of debt, especially for debt that's maybe less productive, like credit card debt, as opposed to a mortgage or something where you're building equity. So something that has been discussed a lot in the economics world, we love to complement our data with government data. The New York Fed has a quarterly survey, and they've shown credit card delinquencies going up. That means people are not able to pay back their credit cards at a higher rates. And we have seen that in our data as well. In the past year, in 2024, compared to the same time last year, there's a much larger share of consumers who have been holding their credit card debt for a year or longer compared to the previous 3 years. If we segment that into income groups, we kind of see a similar dynamics to the savings where we see that those longer wait times of holding on to credit card debt and not paying it down is affecting primarily lower and middle income people. The trend is especially strong for middle income people in that they have been moving closer and closer to the lower income cohort as opposed to staying around the middle between high and low, which tends to be the case. Maybe high interest rates coming down a little bit will help out with this. Do you have any thoughts on how this might play out going forward?
It's sort of it is, yeah, sort of concerning news, and especially knowing from some of our other data that lower and middle income adults compared to high income adults tend to have not as strong credit scores, which tends to lead to higher interest rates on credit card debt. I think a lot of it also comes down to flexibility. When you have more money, when you have more savings stock, as we know the higher income adults do, versus the lower earning groups, you have the flexibility to move your money in a way that benefits you more. And in times when interest rates are very high, it gives that group the ability to pay down debt and not carry as high credit card balances. Because right now, in the way that we've seen rates go, credit card interest rates going up with rates the last couple years, that's very challenging. You don't want to be carrying a credit card balance, and you don't want to be carrying a growing balance. You don't want to be carrying a balance for a longer time. It's expensive to do that. So this is just an extra cost where if you have the luxury to be able to pay down that debt, if you have excess money to pay down that debt, you can avoid that cost. So it's sad seeing that's, just another place of strain. And I think that kind of validates and I think it's one of the things that you and I were looking at, back in July when we were like, we think it's time to cut now.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so hopefully the cuts do help.
Yeah, but that being said, credit card rates are usually higher than other rates. They're around like the 20s a
Hmm.
lot of the times. And so even though rates are going to move down, credit card rates relative to other rates are higher. So it'll
Yeah.
still be pretty high. And the more you hold on to that debt, the more it kind of snowballs and becomes a little bit out of control because that rate is relatively more restrictive than other rates. But it is good news that they cut rates. Not to be a pessimist, but it does take a little bit of time for rates to trickle down to consumers from the Fed. So I don't know when consumers will start to feel relief, but at least we're moving in the right direction there.
Yeah, I agree. If there's a positive note, that's probably it.
Yeah. Okay, well, there's so much more to cover in this report. I highly encourage people to check it out and download it. We didn't even touch on our household emergency expenses section, which is just full of interesting data. There's just, I mean, we could talk about this whole report for hours, but we
We got through
unfortunately
2 slides.
two slides. I mean, it's just full of really interesting information. But we are putting out data all the time on all kinds of topics. We just came out with an election and the economy survey to get consumers and voters' views on different economic issues in relation to the election, and what policies they like and don't like, what candidates they associate with different economic issues, who they trust more. So I highly encourage everyone to check that out. And then the housing report as well is one that's just full of a lot of great information in case any of you missed it. But thank you so much, Kayla. This was a fun first episode. I'm really excited to connect every other week and talk about some of our data and just make it more accessible and easy to understand.
Yeah, that was fun, Sophia, and I'm looking forward to regrouping in a couple weeks and seeing where we're at with the economy and some of our research.
Yeah, thank you. Have a good one. Bye.
Bye.